Now, there's also under the law that part of the free and appropriate public education entitlement applies to children that are homeless, so there's a specific provision in the law that applies to, so that a child that's homeless has the same rights under the federal and state laws to a free and appropriate public education. And a lot of times jurisdiction over which district has responsibility for a child comes back to where the child lives. And for homeless children, they know that since they don't have a residence, they needed to create a special law so those children were captured and covered the same way that other children are. There's also a new section of the law that deals with bullying. That's something that you want to be aware of and should be addressed in the team meeting process. It's whether or not, as a result of your child's disability, they would be vulnerable to the area of bullying, and if so, if they're vulnerable to bullying, what services, what supports need to be in place to address that. So whether your child has issues as a result of their disability that relate to their ability to self-advocate and tell someone if something's happening with another child, you know, sort of speaking up for themselves or bringing something to an adult's attention. That stuff now needs to be addressed in the IEP because we want to make sure that the bullying is addressed in a proactive way so that we're not waiting for bullying to happen. But if your child has vulnerabilities that could make them, you know, the subject of bullying, then we want to work on the skills that the child would need to address that in the event it would happen. Okay, so that's a new section of the law that's come in. Yes, ma'am?
Is there a section now in the IEP for kids once they're out of preschool where you check off a box if you want something with bullying in the IEP? Because at one of these meetings they were talking about a box you can check off that deals with bullying. But my daughter's still in preschool and I didn't see such a box, and I'm wondering, because I definitely would want to have this in our IEP, but how do you put it in there?
Well, you definitely should bring up the issue with your special education coordinator who's, you know, who's running the IEP meeting. And I know that they are still working on the SIM system, and since this law was added, I don't know if that box actually exists, but whether there's a box for it or not, it should be written into the IEP that the team has discussed this issue and whether or not they feel that there's anything that needs to be addressed for the child in the IEP. For some children it won't need to be addressed and for some it will, and that needs to be part of the team discussion and it needs to be documented in the IEP. So I don't know about the box per se. I don't remember seeing one on my own child's IEP, but it's certainly a discussion that should occur and is supposed to occur.
Okay, and if they say that this child would need self-advocacy, like someone on the autism spectrum would need that, what's a typical service they would have? Would it be meeting with a counselor, or how would usually that be put into place, or what would be the actual service?
Well, it really would come back to the child and what those vulnerabilities are, and if it is self-advocacy, I mean, that's something that you could be working on in counseling services. It's also something that could be addressed by a speech pathologist. It's also something that could be addressed by a special education teacher in terms of talking about, you know, you can do sort of a role play or a discussion with a child. If this were to happen, what would you do under those circumstances? You know, or if this happened, how would you feel about that? And really sort of, but again, it would come back to the individual child and what level that child was at in terms of understanding language, understanding social scenarios, what would be typical for a child that age in terms of social interactions that could give rise to a bullying situation. So you'd really look to the members of the team to be able to target that specifically. Okay?
There's also a section of I think the checkbox on the back of the meeting notes where you have to check off yes or no as to whether or not skills and proficiencies to address bullying have been addressed by the team. And it's there to make sure that at every team meeting that there is a full conversation around does your child have the ability to address bullying? And sometimes in that area I've noticed people talking about whether or not there's simply a trusted adult that the child has in the building to go to, and that's identified and clearly written into the plan.
So thank you for that. So what we're being told is that there is a specific section on part of the IEP documents that are made available for the IEP meeting that, you know, directs the team to have that discussion. So I wouldn't get hung up on whether or not there's a box on the IEP or not. You just want to make sure that you bring that up as something that the team discusses, if in fact it's not brought up by the team chairperson, okay? On the next slide talks about sort of bullying solutions and sort of the fact that obviously if something were to happen, that they need to notify the parent of that. So this is really, there's a bullying law overall, but there's a specific provision in there about children with special education needs. Unfortunately, the language of the law is not very detailed. It just says that you're supposed to have the discussion and is the child, I'm not really sure what child that has a disability could, wouldn't have a vulnerability to be the subject of bullying. So I do think it's a discussion every team should be having and addressing in whatever way is appropriate for that individual child. So access to the general curriculum. When we talk about the general education curriculum, we're talking about your child's free and appropriate public education. Part of that is depending on the child's needs, and for all children, part of that is so that they are able to access and make progress in the general education curriculum. So the general education curriculum is what their non-disabled peers are doing at that particular grade level. So for some children, they will be able to access the same content and of information that their non-disabled peers are using, and throughout the course of whether it be reading, math, writing assignments, without it being modified. They may need accommodations, they may need to use assistive technology during that process, they may need specialized services to support them, but the content wouldn't need to be modified in order for them to access and make progress in it. For other children who are below grade level, 1 or 2 grades below, they may in fact need for that, or more years, would need the content itself to be modified, meaning they still need to get access to the content, but in a different way. So whatever this class is studying, say it's, like the Pilgrims and the Mayflower. Well, it would still be the same content, but it may be a different book at a lower level while that child is still working on their reading skills to bring them up to grade level. You still want them to be able to access the content in the grade level curriculum that the other kids are accessing. So what you do is you modify the content at a level that they can access and understand. So you're giving them exposure to what's in their grade level, even though they can't do the same grade level work as their peers, okay? So you want to look at, and if you want to look at what the curriculum frameworks are for a particular grade, and where your child would be if they were, and not on an IEP, then you can go right on the DESE, which is the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education website, and they have the curriculum frameworks right on there. You can look up 4th grade math, 4th grade reading, 4th grade writing, and see what the areas need to be addressed. And you might want to look at that before you go into your child's IEP meeting to give you an idea of, do you think they're at that level in one area, not in another? What do you think that they would need to help them access that type of information? Yes, sir.
Who's that address again?
Oh, it's the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And if you just Google that, I think their website is on here already, that we passed. If everybody signed in this evening and gave us their email address, I will send out by email an attachment of resources that has not only that website, but a number of other websites that are helpful to parents. We've given them out from time to time, and we can certainly send that out to everybody again. But I don't know their website by heart, but it's the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It used to just be the Department of Education, and now they gave it a much longer name, but it's the same thing.
Thank you.
Yep.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
How does that adjustment on modifying the content affect like an MCAS test? What would that have to be modified as well, or will that?
No, for the MCAS test, which children are required to take from starting in grade 3, generally you will have a list of accommodations that child would use, whether it's they need to have, take the test in a different setting, whether there's, unless if it's not assessing reading reading specifically, you could have the test read out loud to them. They may be able to use, you know, if they need something in larger print. But in terms of modifying the content of the MCAS, that is not modified. Okay, so it's actually going to be where your child is on grade level material, and that's what it's meant to assess. I mean, really, you only need to pass the MCAS when the child is in the 10th grade so that they can graduate. But as far as passing the MCAS, the accommodations are to assist your child with taking that test itself, but the content of that is not modified. The majority of children that receive special education take the regular MCAS, and then the 2% of the population that are the most severely disabled, like my own child, they don't take the regular MCAS because they can't access that information. So they take what's called an alternate MCAS. It's the MCAS Alt, which is a portfolio of that individual child's work. So it doesn't show what they can't access or respond to the information at grade level. So what you do is you show that child's individual progress from the beginning of the year throughout the year, but also focus on those same grade level areas. Like, so you would show in ELA what that child's doing this year. And the purpose of that is to show, even though they're not taking the MCAS, that they themselves are making individual growth as a result of their specialized services. But no, they don't modify the MCAS content, to my knowledge. I could be wrong. I certainly don't claim to know everything. But, and since we don't take it, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I don't believe that's it. You get a list of accommodations. And whatever your child has as an accommodation for the MCAS, they also need to be having throughout the year. It's not like you can have an accommodation just when you take the MCAS. It has to be part of your plan throughout the year. You know, because it's almost like they don't want to give you something extra for the MCAS that you don't typically need. So response to intervention, what is it? It's a multi-tiered approach to services, and it exists before a child goes on to an IEP. I know that the district is trying to focus more heavily on response to intervention, because the thought behind response to intervention is to give a child that's not at the same level as their peers more intensive services, you know, before they get to an IEP. So if you see a child's lagging behind in reading or writing in kindergarten and first grade, they want to, before, you know, you don't have to have a disability, you're just not keeping up. What they try to do is bring in those resources earlier and try to get that child's performance up. And they go through a stage process. It's supposed to be, you know, tier 1 is, you know, some supports, tier 2 is more intensive, and then turn 3 is long-term, and it may lead to special education. So it's almost saying, before we jump to an IEP for all children, we're going to try to deal with the issues as they're confronted or as they're revealed. You know, they do sort of, throughout the year, they do assessments in all the different grades to see where the kids are. And if a child was not at grade level or not where they were supposed to be, they would look at that child and bring in additional services or provide more intensive services in the classroom before you get to an IEP. So that's really what response to intervention is. It's not special education services. I think of them more as pre-special education services, because obviously if a child doesn't need to be on an IEP, we don't want to see that happening. But if a child needs some extra support to bring them up in their performance, then we want to give them those supports, because the goal is for all children to succeed and for them all to have better outcomes. RTI, that's the next slide. It's saying we're not going to wait to see if a child fails before we intervene. You know, if a child gets those supports earlier, the likelihood of them succeeding and not needing an IEP, you know, is addressed in a more timely fashion. Because if you think about it, if a child is below grade level in the earlier years, and that's caught early, and you get intervention early, then it's likely that that could be addressed. You know, not for all kids, but for some kids it can be addressed. But if that same child didn't get intervention when they needed it, as they go on in grade level, they're going to fall further and further behind, and it's more likely that they will be diagnosed with a disability, like a specific learning disability, and then they will need an IEP. So it's really an effort to give interventions early to see if that brings about the results that we're looking for, and then if it doesn't, to obviously move on to more intensive types of services. So the special education process, the full IEP, now we're going to get into that. Does everyone here, let me put it the opposite way, does anybody not have an IEP that's here? Okay.
Going through the evaluation.
You're going through a process, okay. Going through the process as well, okay. So I'll try to touch on some more of those procedures, but, so basically as it starts out, it's a referral process, okay? And a referral process for some kids, it happens when they're coming out of early intervention. It's not, limited to children at that young age or when a child is first entering school. A referral process can happen at any time during a child's education. Some things reveal themselves later that didn't reveal themselves when they first entered school. Okay, so you make a referral, and basically that's requesting, and I would suggest whenever you make a request of the school, to do it in writing. And it's not an issue of trust, it's an issue of creating a record. Whenever you, ask for something having to do with your child's special education needs, you want to make sure that you document it. And part of the reason for documenting it and creating a record is that there's specific timelines that go along with these processes. And if you show that you provided a letter on such and such a date, then you can say the timeline for this is now past, what's going on with this situation, as opposed to, well, I called the school 2 weeks ago and no one ever called me back, and then nobody has a record of the phone call. It's just one of those things to start getting in the habit of creating a record. So you want to request everything in writing. So the process is when you make a referral, whether it's by you, whether it's by a doctor makes a referral, tells you to suggest that you get an evaluation, whether the referral comes from, a provider that your child's working with outside of school, if they were getting specific tutoring. It's really a parent or a professional. So it can be the early intervention people that actually make the referrals before the child's turning 3 directly to the school district to start that going. Well, as soon as that referral is made, within 5 school days, you're supposed to get a consent form. And the consent form will list the evaluations that the school is going to do to determine whether or not your child's eligible for special education services. From the time that you sign that consent form, again, you want to keep a copy of everything you sign and everything you send to them. They have 30 school days to complete those evaluations. So, and you have to be mindful of the fact that 30 school days is very different than 30 calendar days. So we're not counting any weekends, we're not counting any holidays, we're not counting any school vacations. Christmas break is a long one, and then we have February and April. Those are all periods of time that you don't count in that process, but you want to follow. When you sign your consent, and you have to turn it in, of course, with the date. You want to count out so that when that 30 days comes around, you want to be saying, what is the status of those evaluations? You're entitled to a copy of all the evaluations that the district does for your child at least 2 school days in advance of the meeting, okay? Now the reason for that is because it's a lot of information coming in. You want to have an opportunity to read those evaluations, to highlight information that you might have a question about or that you don't understand and you want to ask at the team meeting, to highlight information that you may disagree with. So you want to ask, they're not going to tell you that you're entitled to those evaluations if you don't ask for them. And you want to make the request in writing for copies. You can put it right on the consent form. That's what I tell people because it saves you a piece of paper and it saves you having another piece of correspondence. When you sign the consent, you can also write, please provide a copy of all my child's evaluations at least 2 days in advance of the team meeting, okay? Because that is important information, and when you go into a team meeting, it's very hard for parents because it's an emotional time. There's a lot of information to digest. There's a lot of people that are going to be talking to you, and you don't want to be receiving evaluations at the meeting, trying to read them and trying to listen to everyone else at the table. So give yourself that leeway to get that information in advance. Yes?
What about you wait after 30 school days for the evaluation and it's not been done?
That would be a compliance issue, and that would be something that I would want you to write down on one of those cards so I can follow up with you directly if you have a problem with this process, okay? All right. The question was, what if the evaluations had not been done after 30 school days had come and gone? So it's 30 school days to complete the evaluations, and then it's 15 more school days, so 45 school days total from the time you sign the consent form for the evaluations to be completed and for the team to convene, okay? So it's 45 school days from the time you sign the consent that you should be having a team meeting to discuss the evaluations, determine eligibility, and if appropriate, to develop an IEP.
What happens when you sign a consent and you ask to be notified before they do the evaluation? And you're not notified, and it has to be done within 45 days.
So you want, the question was, is you want to be notified before they start the evaluations?
Yeah, like whoever's doing the evaluation, they tell you so-and-so is going to do the evaluation, but you want to speak to that person to give your side of it. And then within 45 days, the evaluation is not done, no one's contacted you.
Well, the issue is if 45 school days have passed and the evaluations haven't been done, that's a compliance issue. It's a procedural violation. But with regard to the issue of your speaking to the evaluator in advance of them doing the evaluation, it's not required, but you can ask for a pre-referral meeting is sort of to talk about what those evaluations are going to be and to provide your input, but the team meeting is really your opportunity to discuss with the providers. Now, part of some evaluations, you know, the school would do like a home assessment, which is not that they're coming to your home to assess the home. It's really to get the parents' input as part of the assessment process to discuss what their concerns are. You know, so it gives, it's not just history and background, some of it will be medical information, but it's also to say, what are your concerns and what are you seeing going on with your child? But there really isn't an obligation for each person doing an evaluation to contact you in advance. I mean, I'd like to think that does happen if you make that request, but I can't tell you that it's specifically required by the law.
Oh.
Now, this says team meeting within 10 school days from receiving the evaluations. I'm thinking that's referring to independent evaluations because it's not consistent with the 45 days. So, oh, sorry. Okay, so if parents have independent evaluations done, then they can submit those to the team, submit them to the school, and this can happen anytime. This is, you know, if you haven't had your initial meeting yet, then obviously you want to submit it before that meeting, so it would be considered at the same meeting. But if you know, anytime your child has an independent evaluation done, you know, if you take them to a neuropsychologist and you have that type of an evaluation done, if you have an outside speech evaluation done, an outside hearing eval, whatever it is, if you submit that to the team and you want it considered regarding your child's IEP, they have 10 school working days from the time that you submit that in order to convene the team and to consider that report and determine what, if any, changes need to be made to the IEP. Okay, so that's 10 school days. The evaluation process, sorry, I'm sorry.
Quick question. In regard to, I know they have the 45 days for the evaluation. In regards to the ABA, I don't know if you can answer this for Boston. I know because of the turnover and their lack of staff, are they still going to be held accountable? Like, are they still, or do they have a leeway in Boston to say, because we didn't have enough staff, we couldn't provide that?
No, I know that there's been a lot of transition with regard to ABA services, and so the changes that have occurred, John Beers tried to deal with that backlog of issues. So what they've done is they've brought on 3 contractors,
Right.
The May, RCS, and Ables. I'm just saying this in case people don't know. And then they also have hired their internal staff, and they have 3 supervisors themselves. There is a backlog with ABA evaluations particularly, and largely that has to do with not enough resources in the field being available to tap to get that done. So while I'll tell you legally, no, it's not like they get an extension because of that, but logistically speaking, if there's no one to do it, how is it going to be done? So it's really an issue of trying to deal with them as quickly as they can through utilizing their new internal resources and their external resources. But I do know that it's an area that continues to be an area that needs improvement and focus. But I will say there's been a lot of improvement with it. I just, so legally, no, they don't get an extension, but if they have everybody that they have working and there's nobody else available to hire, it's more of an issue of, that's...
Will they owe you that time, like say, do they owe you that time to make up, give you extra hours the next year? Because I mean, I know this is like an individual, but I signed mine October 1st, and I got a call yesterday that said it would be done most likely March 1st. I mean, that's a huge, way over 45 days of him getting his initial ABA evaluation. I mean, by the time they do that and actually set up ABA.
I think that would be something that you could certainly bring up at your meeting, and it's hard to say whether or not they would owe you anything, because whether or not a child gets services as a result of that evaluation won't be known until the evaluation is completed. So, but if in fact it does recommend specific services and the team agrees that your child needs a specific number of hours, then you can certainly say, well, this period of time was missed and I'm looking for services to compensate us for that time. So what you would be asking for is called compensatory services.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. So the evaluation process, and as I said, you have a chance to talk to them in advance to express any concerns that you have. You're allowed to do that. It generally does take place when it's an evaluation or referral from early intervention. You sort of do a pre-meeting with Boston to sort of discuss what the concerns are and really identify the types of evaluations that you want them to do. And you should identify also if they send you an evaluation consent form and there's an area that needs to be evaluated that's not listed on that consent form, and that's something you can specifically request. If they left something off, or if there's an issue of a need for a behavioral assessment or something like that that's not listed out because it's not on the general form. Based on what your child's needs are, if there's an area that needs to be assessed, that's something that you want to bring to their attention and request that it happen. Okay? Yep.
You have to sign it right then and there. You go home, take a copy of it home.
You never have to sign anything on the spot. You can always take something home and review it, even the consent form, because as I said, the time that, the date that you sign it, that's when your clock starts ticking on the timelines. If you choose to delay that, whether it's a day or 2 days, it's not going to make much difference. You should always take the time to review anything if you don't feel comfortable signing it. Okay?
Can I just ask a question? On the requesting additional evaluations that aren't on the original consent form, does that, if you're told that that will slow down the process because of that 30-day completion requirement, how does that work? Like if you, like in other words, if you sign the consent form and then you realize later it was missing something that was supposed to be in there and you request it.
Well, what you can do in those circumstances is you can ask them to complete that, and then you can decide yourself whether or not you want to have the team meeting within that original 45 days, or if you want to wait until the other evaluation is completed to have your team meeting. You don't have to wait. You could have the meeting, and then you can reconvene the team after that additional evaluation is completed. Yes?
Like, if we have the team meeting and then there's a schedule or another evaluation after the team meeting, we can just give that to the team after we meet with them, right?
Yep, you can submit evaluations at any time. And as I said, if you do submit an evaluation, they have 10 school days to convene the team to consider that evaluation. Okay, so evaluations and re-evaluations. If your child's deemed eligible for special education and you have an IEP developed by the team, that's to be reviewed on an annual basis. So the team would reconvene every year, and you would look at the IEP, you would look at the goals and benchmarks, what's been achieved, what's not been achieved, what needs to be changed for the next year, and every 3 years, your child gets reevaluated. So that's when you go through the whole process all over again, where they do evaluations of the child, and then you convene the team to determine eligibility, because there's some children that will no longer require special education services as a result of the reevaluation process, and there were children that will continue to require it, but you also want updated evaluations because we don't want to be addressing a child's needs based on information that's 3 years old. In between then, during the IEP year, you're going to get progress reports along with report cards. So the progress report